He discovered his wife's darkest secret after 60 years of marriage, just hours before she took her last breath. 1963, Alabama. The world was divided by color. Black and white didn't mix. Signs dictated where you could walk, eat, and even look. For a black man, being caught with a white woman could mean death. Michael Reynolds knew this truth. Born poor in a small town, he watched his father break his back, working for white men who treated him like dirt. Michael learned to fix cars from his uncle. By 19, he was the best mechanic in town, keeping his head down, staying alive. Then he met Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth came from money. Her father, Richard Taylor, owned half the businesses in town. He raised his daughter to be the perfect Southern belle, quiet, obedient, ready to marry whatever rich white man he chose for her. But Elizabeth wanted more. She was smart, curious, and suffocating under her father's control. They met at a secret jazz club on the edge of town. Places like this existed in shadows, where color lines blurred after midnight. Elizabeth walked in wearing a dress too bold for a girl of her standing. Michael noticed her immediately. Blonde hair falling past her shoulders, blue eyes scanning the room without fear. Their eyes locked. Neither looked away. "What's your name?" she asked, sliding onto the stool next to him. Michael hesitated. "Michael Reynolds." She smiled. "Elizabeth Taylor." They talked all night. Her world fascinated him. The parties, the privilege, the freedom she took for granted. His world intrigued her. The struggle, the strength, the reality beyond her father's mansion gates. It was dangerous. It was foolish. It was inevitable. 2 weeks later, Richard Taylor caught them. Elizabeth had come to the garage where Michael worked. They thought they were alone. They weren't. Richard's car pulled up. The world stopped. His face twisted with rage. "Get in the car, Elizabeth," he growled. She tried to speak. He grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the car. Michael didn't move. He knew better. The next morning, a note appeared under the garage door. "Stay away from my daughter." Elizabeth was locked away. Every move watched. Every call monitored. She fought, screamed, begged. Nothing worked. Her father's word was law, and no court would side with a daughter who wanted to be with a black man. But Elizabeth was clever. A note passed to a maid who'd once loved across color lines. A whispered message to a delivery boy. 3 weeks later, they met behind the old train station. "We have to leave," she said, clutching a small suitcase. "Tonight." Michael nodded. "Once we do this, there's no going back." "I've already decided." That night, they boarded a freight train heading north. Hiding among cargo crates, they traveled in darkness. Every stop, every sound made Michael tense. He expected men with guns to tear them apart, but no one came. They reached Detroit 3 days later. The city was different, still divided, but less violently so. They found a cramped apartment in a neighborhood where people minded their business. Michael got work at an auto plant. Elizabeth learned to sew, taking in mending jobs. Their wedding happened in a tiny church with no guests. Just them and a preacher who looked uncomfortable the whole time. No rings, no celebration, just promises whispered between two people who'd risked everything. Life was hard, money tight. Some nights they went to bed hungry. Michael's co-workers kept their distance. Women in the neighborhood watched Elizabeth with suspicious eyes. They were tolerated, never welcomed, and Richard Taylor hadn't forgotten. Letters arrived at their apartment. The first, "Come home now." The second, "You don't understand what you've done." The third, "You will regret this." Elizabeth burned them all, but fear remained. Her father wasn't a man who accepted defeat. Someday he would find her. So she started saving money, a few coins under the mattress, a few dollars in her coat lining, just in case they needed to run again. 2 years passed. Elizabeth got pregnant. When she held her son James for the first time, instead of just joy, she felt crushing guilt wash over her, because this wasn't her first child. At 17, before Michael, before running away, Elizabeth had gotten pregnant. Her family kept it secret, hiding her away, claiming she was ill. When the baby boy was born, her father arranged everything: a quiet adoption, money changing hands, records sealed. Elizabeth wasn't allowed to hold him. She never even named him. She'd pushed that memory down, buried it deep. But now, holding James, it all came rushing back. Somewhere out there was another son, a boy who'd never know her. She never told Michael. She couldn't. This secret lodged in her heart like a stone, growing heavier with each passing year. James grew quickly, his skin a beautiful blend of his parents'. In time, they had a daughter, Anna. Their family was complete, but Elizabeth's past wasn't finished with her. Not yet. Elizabeth became quieter as the years passed. A shadow crossed her face when adoption was mentioned. She flinched when strangers asked about her childhood. Michael noticed. At first, he thought it was exhaustion. Raising 2 children in a city that barely tolerated them wasn't easy. But it was more. Sometimes he'd catch her staring at old photographs with tears in her eyes. When he asked what was wrong, she'd force a smile and say, "Nothing." Michael wasn't a man who pushed. He understood some wounds ran too deep to speak about. But this was different. His wife was slipping away, carrying a burden she wouldn't share. One night, he found her at the kitchen table, crying over a small piece of fabric. She didn't notice him standing there. In that moment, a terrifying thought crossed his mind. After 20 years of marriage, he might not know his wife at all. Truth was, Elizabeth had married Michael for more complicated reasons than love. She'd been raised knowing her father would choose her husband, some rich white businessman who'd continue the Taylor legacy. Her entire life had been carefully planned, her future decided without her consent. When she met Michael, she saw escape, freedom, a way out of the suffocating life laid before her. She ran to him not just from love, but from fear. This realization haunted her, because now, after years together, she did love him, deeply. She loved how he kissed her forehead before leaving for work, how he rocked their children to sleep, how he never raised his voice, even when angry, how he made her feel safe. But she'd never told him the truth, that when they married, it wasn't only love driving her decision, it was survival. She told herself it didn't matter. Love had come. But the lie festered, especially when their children started asking difficult questions. "Mama, why do people stare at Dad in the store?" "Mama, why don't we have grandparents like other kids?" "Mama, why did Billy's mom say I shouldn't come to his birthday party?" Elizabeth had no answers. The world's cruelty was impossible to explain. Meanwhile, Michael wrestled with his own doubts. He saw how Elizabeth avoided certain questions, how she tensed when he asked about her past. He began to wonder, did she love him because he was her choice, or because he had been her only escape? He never asked. He was afraid of the answer. Then the letter arrived. It was a plain envelope slipped under their door while Elizabeth was shopping. No return address. Just her name and handwriting she instantly recognized. Her father's. Inside, 5 words. "You don't understand what you've done." Elizabeth felt sick. It had been years since her father had contacted her. She thought he'd finally given up. She was wrong. For weeks she waited for another letter. None came. Instead, she noticed a man, white, well-dressed, watching her at the market, then outside Anna's school, then across from their apartment building. Elizabeth didn't tell Michael. She knew what he'd say, that they should confront her father, that they couldn't keep running, but she didn't want confrontation. She wanted the past to stay buried. Then the second letter came. This one wasn't from her father. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the message brief. I know who you are. Elizabeth's heart stopped. Someone had discovered her first child, the son she'd been forced to give up, the secret she'd kept even from Michael. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Michael found the letter crumpled and hidden in her dresser drawer. When he asked about it, she lied, said it was nothing, but he knew better. After 30 years together, he knew when his wife was terrified. The sickness started gradually, a persistent cough, dizzy spells, then sharp chest pains that left her gasping for breath. Michael watched her struggle to lift a pot from the stove, saw her wince when she thought no one was looking. One evening she collapsed while folding laundry. The doctor came the next morning, middle-aged, white, face carefully blank as he examined Elizabeth. When he finished, his expression was somber. "It's your heart," he said. "There's not much we can do." Michael refused to accept it. He found other doctors, searched for treatments, but the answer was always the same. Elizabeth was dying. As her body weakened, the weight of her secrets became unbearable. One evening, as sunset painted their bedroom walls gold, she asked Michael to sit with her. "There are things I need to tell you," she whispered, her voice thin. "Things I should have told you years ago." Michael took her hand, his heart pounding with dread. Elizabeth confessed everything. The money she'd hidden away in case they needed to run again, the doubts she'd had in their early years together, how she'd married him partly to escape her father's control. Then the hardest truth. "Before I met you, I had a child," she said, tears streaming down her face. "A baby boy. My father arranged for him to be adopted. I never even got to hold him." Michael sat motionless, the revelation washing over him like ice water. "The letter you found," Elizabeth continued. "Someone knows about him. My son is looking for me." Michael said nothing. He couldn't. The shock was too great. This woman he'd loved for decades, the Marsa, the mother of his children, had kept a part of herself hidden from him their entire marriage. Elizabeth gripped his hand tighter. "I need you to know something else," she whispered. "I may not have married you for the right reasons, but I love you now. I love you with everything I am. That's the truest thing I know." Days passed. Elizabeth grew weaker. Michael cared for her silently, helping her eat, bathing her, carrying her to bed when she could no longer walk. He didn't speak about what she'd told him. He couldn't find the words. Elizabeth didn't ask. In her mind, his silence was answer enough. Then, on a cold autumn night, as rain tapped against the bedroom window, Elizabeth felt herself slipping away. Michael held her, his arms warm and familiar. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything." Michael leaned close to her ear, his voice breaking as he finally spoke. "I forgive you," he said. "I forgive everything." Elizabeth smiled, her eyes closing for the last time. And just like that, she was gone. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that sinks into walls, into furniture, into skin. Elizabeth was gone, and Michael sat in their bedroom staring at the empty space beside him. For days he hadn't moved her pillow. It still held the faint impression of her head, the last physical proof she'd been there, as if by leaving it untouched he could pretend she was just in the other room. But she wasn't. She was gone, and she'd left him with a lifetime of secrets. Her confession had broken something inside him, not just because she'd lied, but because he'd never suspected. All those years together, he'd believed their love was real, built on trust. Now he questioned everything. Had their life been a lie? Had she ever truly chosen him? Or had he only ever been an escape route, a way out of a life she didn't want? He'd spent his entire life fighting to be seen as a man in a world that saw him as less. Now, even in his own home with the woman he'd loved, he wondered if he'd ever truly belonged. The letters were still there, the ones from her father, yellowed with age, the threats, the warnings, and then the last one with different handwriting. I know who you are. She'd never fully explained what it meant. Now he had to know. Michael opened the drawer where she'd kept them. His fingers trembled as he unfolded each paper. The final letter was brief. Your son is looking for you. The room tilted. He read it again, breath catching in his throat. Her son, not James, not Anna, the one she'd given away, the one he'd never known existed. His hands tightened around the paper. Another child, another piece of Elizabeth that she'd kept from him, a son who had been searching for answers. And now she was gone, leaving only questions that could never be answered. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, Michael allowed himself to grieve. Not just for her, but for the life they'd built. A life he'd thought was real, but now realized had been filled with shadows. The house felt empty without her. Not just the absence of her voice or the rustling of her movements as she cooked or hummed to herself. It was something deeper. The weight of all the things left unsaid. James and Anna didn't understand. They were grieving too, but their pain was different. To them, Elizabeth had been a mother, steady, constant, the center of their world. To Michael, she'd been more. His partner, his home, the woman he'd risked everything for, the woman he'd trusted more than anyone else. Days passed. Michael worked because it was the only thing that made sense. The auto plant didn't care about grief. It demanded the same thing every day. His sweat, his strength, his time. That at least was simple. Nothing else was. Not when he walked through their neighborhood and felt strangers' eyes on him, their silent questions hanging in the air. Not when he lay in bed at night and reached for her out of habit, only to find the sheets cold and empty. And not when he opened the drawer and saw the letter, taunting him with truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. One evening after James and Anna had gone to bed, Michael sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the letter again. No name, no address, just a single fact. A son out there looking for answers. For weeks he wrestled with it. What good would it do to look for this man now? What did he owe a stranger who'd never been part of their lives? But then another thought came. What if it had been James? What if someone had taken his son from him, erased him, made him a secret? Wouldn't he want to know? Wouldn't he deserve to? Michael made his decision. He would find this man. He would give him the truth that had been stolen from him, even if it hurt, even if it changed everything. Because the past had already taken too much, and Michael wasn't going to let it take anything more. It took months of searching, letters to adoption agencies, visits to government offices, dead ends and false leads. Most places wouldn't even talk to him. A black man asking questions about a white woman's child. But Michael persisted. Elizabeth's secret had eaten away at her for decades. He wouldn't let it die with her. Finally, in a small town 300 miles away, he found a name. Thomas Wilson, 42 years old, Elizabeth's firstborn son. The meeting was arranged at a quiet diner just outside Detroit. Michael arrived early, his heart hammering against his ribs. What would he say to this man? How could he explain Elizabeth, her fears, her choices, her secrets? When Thomas walked in, Michael knew immediately. He had Elizabeth's eyes, her way of moving, the same determined set to his jaw. Thomas sat down across from him, silent for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," he finally said. Michael nodded. "I imagine not." "Where is she?" Thomas asked. "My mother." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. "She passed away 3 months ago." Thomas closed his eyes, pain washing over his face. "I was too late." "She never knew you were looking for her," Michael said quietly. "Not until the very end." "Did she ever—" Thomas paused, his voice breaking. Did she ever think about me? Michael could have lied, could have offered comforting words, invented memories that never existed. But he'd had enough of secrets. Every day, he said instead, she never held you, never even named you, but she thought about you every single day. Michael told him everything, about Elizabeth's father, about how they'd met, about their life together, about her confession in those final days. She wasn't perfect, Michael said. None of us are. She made choices she regretted. She kept secrets that nearly destroyed her. But she loved fiercely. She protected what was hers. Thomas listened silently, tears streaming down his face. Would she have wanted to meet me? He finally asked. Michael reached across the table, taking Thomas's hand. She would have given anything for that chance. Thomas nodded, wiping his eyes. I have children, he said, 2 daughters. They have a grandmother they never knew. And they have a grandfather, Michael said quietly, if you want them to. That night, Michael returned home and told James and Anna everything about their mother's past, about the brother they never knew they had, about the complicated, imperfect woman Elizabeth had been. Why did she never tell us? Anna asked, her voice breaking. Because she was afraid, Michael answered. Afraid of losing you, afraid of losing herself. Did you forgive her? James asked. Michael was quiet for a long moment. I'm still learning how, he finally said. But I loved your mother for who she was, not who I wanted her to be. That's what real love is. 3 months later, Thomas came to dinner with his wife and daughters. The house that had been so empty after Elizabeth's death filled with new voices, new laughter. As Michael watched his family expand before his eyes, his children meeting their brother, his granddaughters playing in the living room where Elizabeth had once rocked their parents to sleep, he felt something shift inside him. The pain didn't disappear. The questions didn't all get answered. But in that moment, he understood what Elizabeth had tried to tell him before she died. Love wasn't perfect. It was messy and complicated, and sometimes built on shaky foundations. But it was also resilient. It could grow from the most broken places. It could heal the deepest wounds. And sometimes, even after 60 years of secrets, it could still find a way to make things whole. If this story touched your heart, hit the subscribe button right now. Have you ever kept a secret to protect someone you love? Is honesty always the best policy in relationships? Share your thoughts in the comments below.